2023 was a year of absolutely fantastic music, ranging from incredible opening and ending songs to some of the most innovative and exciting uses of background music I've ever heard, anime or otherwise. We can easily thank the composers and sound directors for their work on making these songs and tracks work, but more than just what we'd expect from the staff is the absolutely amazing way in which familiar composers like Hayashi Yuki and Dewa Yoshiaki flipped their styles entirely to deliver something that not only fit the show, but also completely deviated away from the style we've grown familiar with in order to do so. And while Hayashi's soundtrack for Insomniacs After School and Dewa's for Hell's Paradise may have been some of the most shocking revelations of the year, what easily proved itself as the strongest soundtrack of the year, ignoring Crunchyroll's abysmal awards ceremony, was the brilliantly cinematic soundtrack for Trigun Stampede, undoubtedly setting a new standard as Kato Tatsuya's absolute best soundtrack to date. Kato Tatsuya, despite composing some of anime's best soundtracks, is probably not a name many anime fans are familiar with. Most known for series like Food Wars, Dr. Stone, and Review Starlight, my first introduction to his music was actually through the lesser-known title Comet Lucifer, a series that really doesn't deserve mentioning aside from its incredible soundtrack. Back in those earlier days, about a decade ago, Kato had a very distinguishable style, one that was immediately recognizable from some specific aspects of his music. For me personally, the most characteristic feature of his music was his usage of one particular high flute and piccolo run, and to a certain extent it still is. This isn't a bad thing, quite the opposite really, as it allows almost any style of music to become recognizable as his as long as he has this sort of sonic stamp affixed to it, not unlike Hisaishi Joe's signature Ghibli chord. It also doesn't detract from his overall soundtracks because it's simply a short compositional signature rather than an overarching stylistic choice that encompasses all the music he writes, something that would render his soundtracks and their associated settings indistinguishable from one another. Like any great artist, his music has also evolved tremendously over the last decade that I've been following him, to the point where it's become recognizable as his without needing any specific sort of musical signature or clue to make you realize it. That isn't to say that he's abandoned these techniques that made his style iconic, but between the more recent seasons of Dr. Stone and of course Trigun Stampede, it's clear to see that Kato is ready to barrel into the future with some of the best and most movie-like soundtracks that we may hear out of anime for the foreseeable future. The track playing right now is one half of the two that capture the entirety of what Trigun Stampede is about. Immigrant Space Explorer acts like an overture for the overarching narrative of Trigun, placing us in a dramatic adventurous setting infused with some sci-fi elements as evidenced by the fusion of electronic and orchestral sounds. It also serves to give us a taste of Kato's attempts to lean into a more Hollywood-esque soundscape for this project, heard in the particular orchestration style he's gone for: non-melodic, pulsing drums and rhythm sections, string drones, simple guitar accents, and his method of developing both the strings and horns for increased intensity over what would otherwise be a fairly repetitive pattern. Again, this isn't bad, and is actually how most big-budget film scores are produced in the West nowadays, so it's mostly a stylistic choice that we basically don't hear in Eastern media much, especially not in anime. And this is the second track that captures the other half of what Trigun is all about, the more spaghetti western aspect of the story. Yes, this is a story set in a sci-fi universe with crazy settlements and technology on some kind of Earth-adjacent planet, but with the desertification of this planet mixed with its cowboy-like towns and characters, it'd be foolish not to prominently display instruments popularized in Western classics like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Most notably, the soundtrack features a whistling soloist, harmonica, and slide guitar throughout, often supported by some of the more orchestral or electronic elements that the first track introduced to keep us in the mindset of the setting, while still making the Western aspect more prominent. Kato also makes sure to differentiate tracks associated with Vash by adding in saxophones and vocalists. Notice the very similar style of music while adding in some differentiating elements to cue in the viewer or listener to the character of Vash while still placing him in the western desert setting. This is also important to keep in mind for future moments where the desert setting is taken away, but these elements are still tied to the action-packed or dramatic scenes that Vash is placed in. This is where the video is going to start getting into spoiler territory, so if you haven't watched Trigun Stampede but clicked on the video because you wanted to know about its music, sorry. But here's fair warning to click off now. This is the first time we hear the theme of the story's primary antagonist, Million's Knives, who shows up right near the beginning of the series and demonstrates his power by destroying a whole town with no regard to the lives of the people inhabiting it. One of the first moments that we see of him is as a hooded figure playing a piano, a characteristic that will play an important role in every iteration of his theme going forward. We see in later episodes that he played the instrument as a child, introducing the theme as a piano solo initially, with Vash joining him to play the theme as a duet. This works in multiple ways to tie the story together, the most obvious being that it ties the theme to a point in Knives' past that continues onto the present moment, and the more musically relevant being that because the piano is the instrument most associated with nostalgia in film scores, it also gives the viewer an unconscious cue that Knives' theme is something that has to do with his past. As the series progresses, we also hear multiple iterations of this theme, the current version being a fairly moderate mixture of piano and orchestra. Others are stripped down to the more core elements, namely as piano solos or duets, while some also go in the opposite direction, integrating the main melodic content into a fully orchestral rendition played by the strings and horns. But what has to be one of the more brilliant aspects of how Knives' theme ties itself into the soundtrack is the way that Kato subtly hid it within the overture theme we heard before. If we take a look at the basic melodic structures of both themes, you can clearly see the similarities in the shapes that these two themes share. While you could argue that this is mere coincidence or simply conjecture on my part, it's clear that the number of similarities shared between the two are too many to think this was just a happy accident. Kato intentionally chose to write the overture in this way, linking the show's main villain into the overarching narrative right from the first piece on the soundtrack. The subtlety comes from how he split Knives' melody up across the overture, playing it against different harmonies and slightly different intervals to give the soundtrack some thematic coherence without being too on the nose. And this is just perfect scoring down to a T. Thanks to just how strongly these melodic elements are ingrained into the core of Trigun Stampede's sonic atmosphere, even just hearing the harmonic progressions of Knives' theme lets us know what we're hearing without the melody that we've naturally come to associate it with. This becomes apparent in the track that plays when Vash and Knives first reunite in the plant factory as teenagers, leaving us with only the harmonies as Knives' plan begins to start taking shape and being made known to Vash. By making these things so readily recognizable in our minds, it also emphasizes the contrast Knives' theme has to Vash's, one that is opposingly fast-paced, exciting, and more of a jazz hip-hop fusion to counter the daunting and dramatic piano and orchestra of his brother. This is the final piece that I want to delve into, and is oddly one of the tracks that has the least to do with most of what I've talked about thus far while still complementing the soundtrack, albeit in a completely different way than the other tracks. So far we've touched on the main thematic elements of instrumentation, overall atmosphere, and the characters themselves, but one aspect that I haven't mentioned so far is the underlying melancholy associated with the story, one that plagues the characters in spite of the high-octane goofy antics they may find themselves wrapped up in. The current track certainly isn't the only track that gives us a moment to breathe and take in the emotions of Vash and the world around him, but it is one that stands out to me when I think back on the soundtrack as a whole. We first hear this track and its melody in episode 8 during Vash's flashback, detailing how he was brought up in the researcher colony after he and Nai ended up on No Man's Land. While this isn't the first track that sounds like this in the series or even in this episode, what separates this from the others is how it feels open and expansive, swelling between moments of solitude in sadness to illustrate Vash's feelings while his sense of the world expands. This track plays after he has agreed to help Luida and Brad investigate the plants, using his own abilities as a plant to communicate with the life forms on the desert planet and restore life to the dying land. It acts partially as a montage track, which is easy enough to imagine, but also plays over quite a few moments of dialogue to show how his outlook begins to change thanks to their mentoring. Delving into the musical side, the track opens with a melancholic piano solo, introducing us to a sparse melody in what sounds like E minor, circling around E5, B minor 7, C major 7, D major 9, and A, a 6-3-4-5-2 movement. From a musical standpoint, this chord progression is super interesting as it opens up seamlessly from what sounds like a very dark and minor opening into a much more grounded E major in the following section, a move made possible by the fact that the initial E5 doesn't actually give any harmonic context aside from the very first pickup note of D implying that it should be minor, as this sounds like a whole tone step up from the natural minor's 7th. The use of the major 2 chord A is also pivotal, as it acts as our secondary dominant 5 of 5 to make the transition from E minor to E mixolydian feel as natural as possible. This shift from dark to light is an obvious representation of how this new environment and lifestyle has impacted Vash following Nai's betrayal and rebirth as Knives. If we approach things more directly, we can take the tonal center of E to be Vash's mental state, clearly starting from a darker and more lonesome sound but opening up to a brighter one accompanied by strings, a horn, and later vocalists. We can also observe the moving rhythms in the piano to show how Vash has chosen not to stagnate and wallow, instead actively working alongside the researchers to help restore life to No Man's Land. The brighter section has us circling back around to a sparse E minor section by way of E major, B minor flat 6, C major 9, D add 9, A7 sus 4, a 1-5 flat 6, 7, 5 of 7. Because we find ourselves in a mixolydian mode rather than a straight E major, the chromatic step up from B minor to C major actually sounds quite natural despite the fact that C natural isn't in our key. It also gives way to the diatonic step up to D, playing out in a triumphant rise that needs to be resolved up to E, only to leave us hanging on a suspended A chord instead. The breadth given by the 9th chords gives a wide sense of space, which nicely accompany the visuals of the sprawling desert plains Vash and Brad are riding across, while the accompanying triumphant rising motion also complements the sense of connection Vash can feel as he speaks to the plants. The unresolved 7th, accompanied by a suspended 4th and acting as a secondary dominant, leaves the continuation feeling open to whatever may come at us next, which quite fittingly extends this lack of resolution. The next section returns to a sparser sound, allowing dialogue to return to the scene without competition, as well as giving time to process how Vash's mental state has been affected by what he's been through. The piano and strings play some repetitive patterns of C6-9 and D6, light and unconcerning, but also chords that don't quite feel resolved. This changes as we shift this pattern up a minor third, chromatically stepping from D6 into an E flat 6 to F6. Having this extended rising motion allows for a brighter build, accompanying the scene that shows us Brad's acceptance of Vash as a member of the team, forming a bond of trust that his wariness had been preventing him from up until this moment. The slight step away from our tonal center also mirrors the awkward way in which Brad shows that he actually does care about Vash, as well as the surprise that Vash must feel after having felt so isolated by the person constantly at his side. From the F chord, we then fall back into our original E mixolydian key, adding in a vocal section to even further fill out the richness of the sound textures, as well as providing a more expansive atmosphere for us to understand Vash's worldview. There are some interesting chord progressions in here, but more important than what these chords are is the way in which they fall back into a very dark sound, leading us into a gloomy repetition of the intro section with a melancholic violin solo playing over top. The scene it plays over actually seems to contrast the feeling being portrayed, as Luida gives Vash his signature red jacket, welcoming him as a full-fledged member of their research team, much to his excitement. What this melancholic sound does is tie the feelings he has back to his upbringing with Nai and Ram, recalling a time before the betrayal and destruction tore his family apart. However, while the feelings of sadness over this recollection are present, he also recounts the good imparted on him from Ram, allowing him to take comfort in this gift as a way to feel at home in this new place with a new family that takes care for him. The final section closes out with another repetition of the earlier B section, this time once again accompanied by vocals to fill out the sonic texture. As it builds out, we're left on a hanging A sus chord, a fitting move for this track as it sounds quite pleasant to hear. But with the knowledge that the story continues beyond this fleeting moment of happiness, there is no resolution back to E to close the piece off neatly. This has all been a mere look back into Vash's past, and this track was meant to show what good came of his experience in spite of all the hardships he had to endure. For a fleeting moment, Vash had a home after his original was destroyed, and through it he learned of the beauty and vastness of the world and its people. It takes a lot to capture those complex emotions through music alone, but even without the accompanying visuals, Kato made a spectacular piece of music to illustrate those feelings of hardship, happiness, and home. Trigun Stampede is a perfect example of how to write a cinematic score for a TV series. I've talked about a lot of soundtracks on this channel before and mentioned that a lot of them also use cinematic or Hollywood aspects to make them stick out in a way that we usually don't get in anime soundtracks. But Trigun Stampede is possibly the first time that I've actually meant it wholeheartedly. I can't fully convey in words just how incredible the music for this show is because it's actually just unreal how much musical intelligence had to go into writing the score, and I can't praise Kato enough for the amazing work that he did. And on the flip side of all of that, it continues to infuriate me to no end that no one on the Crunchyroll Awards judging panel even put this through for a nomination when it shouldn't have even been a competition, that this was the best soundtrack or score of the year. All of that aside, what did you guys think of Trigun Stampede's music, and do you agree with me that it is Kato Tatsuya's best soundtrack to date? Let me know down in the comments below, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel. I know it's been a while since I last posted anything on YouTube, but I have been doing my best to keep things up to date on Patreon with exclusive content like extended cuts of videos, as well as all of the transcriptions that I do for my more analytical videos, including this one. So if you want access to any of that, make sure to go and support me on Patreon, patreon.com/GengaJupite. Thanks as always for watching, and I will see you in the next one.